technically 12:03. It's my pleasure to welcome my colleague, Abbey Stemler, from Business Law and Ethics at the Kelley School, and also an Ostrom affiliate, who's done a ton of work with me on various events here at Ostrom. So we're incredibly happy to have her paper today on Supracompetitive Privacy. She knows she gets about 7 minutes, and then I'm going to cut her off and turn off the slides. And then we'll open it up for questions, and I'll do my best to keep a list. I'm pretty bad at it, though, so hold on to your tongue, and I'll do my best. Okay?
All right, thanks everybody for coming out. Fourth thing before we get started, I met Eleanor Ostrom when I was in grad school, and it's just such an honor to be here because I've never met somebody with so much intellectual superpower, horsepower, who was also so kind. So I am excited to be a part of this. Second thing, I was really hoping for a smaller crowd, so bear with me as I answer your questions. Third, I prepared about an hour's lecture, and Angie just told me I have 7 minutes, so that's great. And then this is the public debut of this paper, so I'm sure you have a lot of helpful, critical feedback, and I welcome it. Very much a work in progress, but this has been about 8 months in the making, very much coming off of my research on platform-based business models. A ton of that, but this is my first foray at all. You know, I never even took an antitrust class, so if you're talking about that end, my co-author, but I will, convey your feedback to him. All right, so let's begin. First click. Miss Raymond, Professor Raymond. So when is a company with only 2 products and revenues of $300 million a year worth $3.2 billion? Well, if you read the paper, click. When it has a lot of data and the potential to collect it. So that was Nest and Google. And don't worry, Google's not the only one who's bad at math. Facebook bought WhatsApp for $20 billion when it only had about $10.5 million in revenue. 50 employees. So, go on. This is all based on these platform-based business models that are behemoths, right? They grow bigger and bigger, the more users participate in them, the more data collected, and Google is the epitome of a platform-based business model. This might be surprising because you think they're a search engine, but really they're connecting the public with advertisers. So, 2 sides of that transaction. Google gets a cut on each of the advertisements, and the users get targeted ads to hopefully make their lives a bit better, or at least buy a new toothbrush. I know I've been taken by Quip many times over, keep getting refills. And this data drives learning through the data network effect. Again, the more information plugged into the system, the better the machine learning is. I'm sure lots of you are familiar with this, which allows a lot of personalization, a lot of profiling, and really getting in our minds, perhaps learning who we are better than we know ourselves. So massive amounts of revenue. These companies are beyond gigantic, bigger than we've ever seen. You can see the market cap of the top 20 platforms is bigger than the US budget, $6 trillion. And so they have a lot of power to acquire new firms, collect even more data, store that data, and use that data. Okay. So where does all this data come from? Many different sources, basically everywhere. And it's quite disturbing, and Scott can get in this too, but it comes from everywhere. Your pictures on your phone with the metadata built into that, whenever you see them access to your pictures or your contacts, don't do it, because they get everything. Apps, the Weather Channel app just had a big expose saying actually they're not really providing you with the weather. They are taking your GPS coordinates so that advertisers can target your exact location. So when you walk into, I don't know, someplace cool, Hot Topic, and you get coupons or email follow-ups, you know why. In addition, there are some creepy aspects of Uber, of course, so that it's actually been shown that they were collecting data even after people had deleted the app. And you also got, of course, your search histories, the background data of all your searches, that sort of thing. Okay, so what are the costs to consumers in this? So I use Daniel Solvog's taxonomy of privacy harms because this is a privacy piece. And so what my co-author and I did was kind of figure out the real privacy harms. Mostly the monetary costs of the harm. So we have three monetary categories. The collection, so all the purchasing of webcam covers and that sort of thing. When I first saw that, I was like, should I have one of those? And then I saw that it was a promotional product. I'm like, I guess I really should have one of those. The psychological cost in terms of therapy, knowing that Target knows you're pregnant, or new one, Uber just got a patent on figuring out when you're drunk based on how you hold your phone, based on your typos. I think it would look like I was drunk all the time. And other data about where you are and that sort of thing. Dissemination, this is a huge category, billions of dollars lost in identity theft, billions of dollars spent in terms of preventing identity theft. I know I use LastPass, I use all kinds of blockers to make sure my data is not prevented. I'm even thinking about buying insurance to help me if something does go awry. That's becoming a new industry. So those were all actual harms. And then, creepily enough, we get into the manipulation, the prediction of behavior, which I've written a paper on related to how that might impact deliberative democracy, especially if platforms influence local politics by mobilizing their user bases. So platform advocacy, if you're interested in that one. All right, moving on. So why is this an antitrust issue? Because we have costs and they're externalized. It's classic if you're looking at very basic antitrust law, and I know some of you know it a lot better than me. But this is weird because for the first time, we're looking at free products being delivered to consumers. We're at a very, very low cost. Lots of consumer surplus, right? So this looks like it's good under antitrust, like Chicago schools framework. But there are actual costs that we're not seeing because one side is highly subsidized, the other side is charged a lot, and the side that's subsidized is losing their privacy, which has, again, previous slide, monetary costs. Okay, so these privacy harms aren't internalized by the antitrust enforcers. They kind of mention it in Europe, but really we're in a new space. And if you want to talk about non-price aspects of this, don't worry, I don't, so you don't have to share your thoughts. So privacy injuries should incur antitrust scrutiny, and breaches the costs are greater than if there had been competition. So if we're thinking about competition, supply and demand forces working, we have to make sure all the costs are internalized. This was always the signal I learned in econ in high school, supply and demand. And we need a competitive environment to make sure those privacy costs are internalized. You're like, am I approaching 7 minutes? Okay, go on. Super competitive privacy. I don't know if you've heard of super competitive pricing, but this is kind of where we had the play on words, and hopefully with a one or two word title will get picked up by a journal. But monopolists charge super high prices when there is an absence of competition. So in our case, we argue that monopolists charge much in privacy costs, so much more than there would be in a robust market. And my co-author, very cleverly, I think it might be shit research, but created an empirical analysis, looking at the churn rate, looking at how many people left a platform, and found that after privacy breaches, most users of the dominant platforms didn't actually leave because they have nowhere to go. There was a great piece in Gizmodo the other day, I don't know if you saw it, but it was basically this woman trying to get rid of all the big 5 tech firms, and she couldn't without totally devastating her career and her life. And funnily enough, she learned that DuckDuckGo, this bastion of privacy, was actually supported by Amazon Web Services. So your data was going away, even with DuckDuckGo. So if costs, again, I'm repeating myself, were internalized more on the privacy dimensions, we would see better privacy protections. Okay. And then implications for this research, kind of the next steps. I want to write a piece on the original goals of antitrust law, which if we ignore the Chicago School and go back in time to when these laws were passed, they were much more concerned with political influence of big business. And so looking at that, looking at the privacy dimensions from a political side, from that manipulative prediction of behavior, And then question existing merger policy. As you saw, we talked none about mergers except at the very beginning because the next example is so good. And then open the door to future empirical researches because we realize we're just scratching the surface. And I'm not a quantitative specialist, so hopefully Greg will have some ideas in that regard. Okay, I think that's close. I don't have a watch.
Very close. Thank you.
Okay, hour, 7 minutes. I'll take your questions. All right, so this feels like a congressional hearing.
It does.
A bit like Zuckerberg right now, but maybe I need a higher chair. I'll just sit up straight. Lee, yeah, please.
Well, lots of questions, but I'll just start with one. I think with these harms, the question is, and it gets down to the empirics too, but let's just look at the conceptual issue first. Is the average consumer worse off? So
Yes.
in other words, we've got harm that's inflicted that you measure in an aggregate harm, and then you put per capita.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, I've never been harmed. As far as I know.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Who knows, right?
Yeah.
I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on most of this stuff. But yeah, I'm on Amazon. I'm on Google, of course.
Yeah.
But it gets to two issues. Consumers' behavior and consumers' pressure will depend on the likelihood of the event harming them.
Mm-hmm.
So that if it's a very, very small probability event, like a hurricane, wildfires, getting hit by lightning, those are very small probability events. So we do what we can, but if it's an ordinary event where the probability of me getting harmed is the same as everybody else in the room, that's a really different issue. And I think you need to think hard about the conceptual aspect of this, and then how you estimate it, and then what I think the FTC should do about it. Because there's lots of ways they could go about this. I don't think busting them up is actually the right way, but we can come to that. So that's no, but it's this average consumer versus these outliers who really get hit hard.
Right. So let me speak to privacy law more generally, the concept of privacy. Many people think that we don't really care anymore. My generation especially, I'm a millennial, so I guess I'm not cool anymore, zennials, but we don't care. And I think as we see more of the exposure to the privacy harms or the creepiness of Uber knowing we're drunk, or the Zuckerberg testimony where Congress really figured out how do you make money? So that's a problem. Everybody says we don't care. We don't feel it. I think in the future we will begin to feel it. And even if we don't really have that public perception as much, still having regulatory bodies take into account the aggregate costs, I think, is something they should begin to think about. I don't think this is going to happen right now. We're at the beginning of potentially a very dangerous time because these platforms do have the potential to do harm. And then I would like you to see one of the statistics I put in there about the average cost of identity theft, which is, again, maybe a hurricane, but a lot of people experience it, and the average cost is about $1,000. So what I did to kind of, again, give an average cost of the consumer was take all of the identity theft research to figure out what the total harm would be, and then I could make an average.
Well, what I'm suggesting is average might not be the appropriate measure you want to use when you're thinking about harm.
Yeah.
Because when you are harmed, it's very bad, and yet on average, we may not be harmed. So the regulatory, how you want to go after that in a regulatory fashion may well be different.
Right. So I might say, do we always need to have such a severe harm? I think about Amazon and diapers.com. Like, Amazon totally wiped out the competition for diapers, and we don't realize we're paying more. And so that is still an anti-competitive behavior, but we don't feel it too greatly. So I again, this is where I might have a limited understanding of how antitrust actually works in practice, but I think that's not a deal breaker for this paper.
Oh.
Yeah,
Yep, sorry. try.
So I kind of was approaching this and reading it from a Coasian point of view. And so I'm kind of thinking like the two options here are why isn't there a Coasian solution? Right? So what are the transaction costs that are stopping entrepreneurs from figuring ways out? If we care about privacy so much, what's blocking the entrepreneurs from actually finding a solution to this? Because it seems like this is a really profitable thing. Maybe it's just the trade-off that we're making where we like these services more than the cost that we're having. But the other thing that really seems to be missing here, maybe it's just a different paper, admittedly, but it seems like it's like your Nirvana fallacy. It's like a market failure. There we go, government.
Right.
Why should we expect government to enact this? My understanding of antitrust legislation is it is a massive field of capture theory through and through.
Yeah.
I mean, the first part of it was like small business and medium business with the Sherman Antitrust Act didn't like that they couldn't compete with the larger firms. Then you have the large firms not liking that business. So you have the Clayton Act and the Federal Trade Commission, basically drafted by large businessmen in order to capture this. And right now, the environment really does seem to be these firms are completely aware of this. I mean, Zuckerberg gets called into Congress, and it's like, yeah, we'll help you regulate. And to me, I'm sitting there like, that's crazy.
Right.
This problem is real. So, like, why? What? From a public choice lens, what is it to stop these firms from even capturing this? Shouldn't we really kind of just set it so that we let it so entrepreneurs can figure a way around this, rather than immediately saying, let's throw it to the monopoly of government to fix this?
Yeah, I think regulatory capture is definitely a thing, and I think there might be some more, solutions beyond creating a law, something so a statutory solution. So we might see more causes of action, the ability to incorporate this into the real cost analysis. So I see that potentially going there. Again, you're going to get this caveat all over the place. Antitrust is not my specialty. And then also I go back to the fact that this is a new space. Yes, we've always seen kind of rumblings of this. I can go back to Yahoo and AOL, like they seem to be forever dominant, and now they're not, they're dead. But I do feel this is a feeling so great from an academic point of view, that we are in a new space. And so as we figure out how to deal with these, this is one perspective in terms of the overall solution. If you look at the literature in privacy and antitrust law, most people say it's not appropriate to look at it here. If it is appropriate, it's because it's a non-price injury. So the quality is damaged. Many people say this is a consumer protection issue. And I just really want to push back to say we need to put many things in our arsenal for approaching this very large problem. And I might be totally wrong.
So one reason, I sort of want to change the language, or at least the construct here.
Not the title.
When I download an app, I'm the supplier. I'm not the customer. The relationship, the business relationship, is between the data accumulator and whoever buys the data. That's the business. The monopoly is between the producer, Google and Facebook and everybody else, and the supplier, me, you, everybody else. They have a lot of power over me. One way entrepreneurs could enter, one Coasian solution could be entrepreneurs pay me to use their app. Right? I mean, just tell me they're going to do this and pay me to use the app. I would certainly use a search engine that somebody paid me to use over Google. And this may be coming.
Yeah, and this is Eric Posner's argument that we should be paid for our privacy.
Paid for the privacy, and I know so I guess the issue is, why doesn't that happen? To the extent that government is getting in the way and treating people as consumers and being abused, I have a sense that that's keeping people from getting paid. I, by the way, had a million questions on your empirical work, but maybe when we get there,
please just.
I'll ask some questions on that. But anyway, I tend to think the reason why antitrust law has such problems with this is it's set where consumers are taken advantage of, and consumers are not taken advantage of here.
But I would say
suppliers are taking advantage of it.
So I'll push back on that. So with a platform-based business model, which this is in part, now not everything Google does is based on its platform. You think of it as selling a Nest or those Google Home products, which freak me out beyond belief. So that may be more of a linear, normal transaction where we have a producer selling directly to a customer. But I would say that with Google selling advertisers' data, that is connecting the demand side, the users, with the supply side, the advertisers. And so this is something that we're beginning to struggle with when we think about what is a platform, what is a multi-sided platform. We go into the Tyrol's, Nobel laureate Tyrol's kind of view of, hey, this is something that is different than kind of that linear business model. And so I would say it's not just the relationship, though it's part of the negotiation between advertisers and Google. Because yes, Google is in turn setting the price, but it wouldn't be able to set the price so high if they hadn't created such a demand of the users. So we have two sides working. The platform definitely mediates that transaction and gets a cut of everything, but it's really connecting two sides. Platform plays a role, but when we have one side getting bigger, it benefits the other side, and we have lots of situations where one side is subsidized. So you talk about getting paid. Think about the Amex case. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this, but I'm a credit card nut. I love frequent flyer points. And so Amazon pays me 5 points per dollar spent on hotels and flights. Love that. And in exchange, merchants get access to me, better access and availability. So in some ways we are getting paid, and yes, consumers get a benefit from this, but what are the actual whole costs? And again, this might be very different than what antitrust allows, but I think it is important to recognize the real costs to privacy. And right now we ignore it.
Well, that, of course, is going to be, that's the data question, right? What is the cost?
Yeah.
How do we measure that?
Yeah, and measuring is...
I didn't see anything in your paper about that.
Yeah, and that is definitely a weakness, and that's why we try to have an empirical part, but we realize this is the first of many papers if this goes somewhat well, and so it would be great. We would be contributing much to the overall literature if we could quantify that, which might be a little bit beyond our capabilities, but no doubt a great point. Yeah.
Scott was next. Sorry.
Okay,
sorry. I got you.
No. We can do it in any order that's convenient. Yeah. I similarly, there's a lot of stuff I'd like to pick up on, but I'll just do kind of a few in no particular order here. One, this conversation about how do we measure the privacy harm is really interesting because it depends on a few things, right? Which consumers are we talking about? Where are they located, right? Are they in California? Are they in European? Are they, European customers of an American business? Because that's changing now rapidly in terms of how GDPR can value people's privacy. Look at the fines that are already being enrolled there.
Yeah.
And also, we don't, frankly, look to all private data as being equal in terms of the privacy protections we like to see on it, right? So as you know, if it's financial data, if it's health data, we built in more protections than if it's your IP address. Whereas if you're European, that's also protected under GDPR, right? So I think maybe not treating privacy as quite such a monolithic entity, maybe in the paper, maybe trying to suss out a little bit about what particular characteristics of it are the most important, and then trying to get at least, think more about why this particular aspect might be the most kind of interesting to pick on.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
so I would ask a question of you. So we had to adopt some kind of simplified framework for defining privacy. So we do use Solov's taxonomy.
Which is great.
And so
You gotta pick one.
do you think that kind of easy way to jump on to quickly get to the point about what privacy is and the 4 categories I have of privacy losses, because that's what we're really talking about, the loss of privacy.
Yeah.
When our data gets out there, we get manipulated by it, or we get...
I think it's a starting point. I think if it was me, and don't take this as gospel by any stretch, I would start with that, and I could picture some type of a table where you'd have the various privacy harms, and then you'd have various governance frameworks mapped onto it to identify what gaps are and kind of where they exist. Because obviously GDPR is way more comprehensive than the new California law, for example, right? And then just a few other notions to throw out there, and I want to continue the conversation elsewhere too. A lot of cool stuff on market failures around cybersecurity and data privacy out of the Mercatus Center. So if you haven't already seen those, I'm happy to send some links. You could also think through, we're trying to price privacy, in essence, to do some type of cost-benefit analysis here, but is that the right approach? Is privacy priceless? Should we think about it as more of a corporate social responsibility, which brings in a whole other approach and lens and literature, right? And some companies are taking that step. Facebook is not. I just started that new book, Zucked. I'm not sure if anybody's seen that yet. That's just fascinating and terrifying. And the last thing that was mentioned, not letting black letter law be the only solution. Obviously, there's a lot of cool literature around cyber regime complexes and relatedly polycentric governance, which could provide a little bit of a framework to think about at least. And like David Victor, who was here last year talking about an environmental context, he's done some work that could be relevant. So I'm happy to help out there too.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah. Overall, this is excellent. Seriously, and I love the title. Don't change the title.
I am comparativist, so always I have to ask this question. Do we have any examples from other countries in terms of taking actions against this?
So Germany is questioning this in terms of merger policy. So they are asking, what does the concentration of data, or what does the concentration of business, how are businesses concentrated, the monopolists or the oligopolist, or however we want to say it. I know monopolist is a loaded term. But when they were looking at merger policy for, I can't remember the firm, but they said, okay, what would this impact be for privacy? And they give some guidance, but it hasn't actually influenced the decision. There are rumblings. Again, this might go to the part that this is a new terrain, and we don't have a lot of precedent because these firms have never been so large and getting larger, right? It's an exponential growth. Yes, there could be a competitor that comes along, and I by no means am saying Facebook is here to stay, because young people say it's dead. WhatsApp is the new thing, and there's probably something else I don't know, or Snapchat. I haven't figured that one out. But they are beginning to think about this, so I think Europe might make the first move, especially in terms of merger policy, and we definitely need to take note of what they do and how it works. But again, new space, if we look historically as kind of a comparative analysis and we busted the trusts, they were very different in terms of a linear business model, because they were producing coal or oil to sell. And now we have this,
Cool.
I want to ask a question about privacy harm as a negotiation boundary, because it's the kind of idea that it's not stable. It's the negotiation between the technology that we know how to abuse data. It's the negotiation between consent, the user consents, and how data is being exploited. Sometimes something is a harm, we don't recognize it that way. And I think when we think of privacy as an individual concept, which is what researchers tend to think of it, and what seems to come out that is if you anonymize data, then it's not a privacy issue anymore. But there's still a harm that can come from that, right? Referring to Professor Virginia Eubanks' book about using data in predictive analysis, that is not using your data in that manner to build a model. It's not a privacy issue, but it's an issue on a structural level, on a collective level. And the issue here seems to be that the definition of harm is applied in the sense that researchers try to come up, and it's kind of a race between people who try to abuse data and people who try to protect it. And it changed over time as the more we understand about privacy. So how do laws catch up with that?
How do laws catch up with that? Another awesome title is Chasing Unicorns. I don't think I'll ever be able to use it, but that ability to catch up, there's always going to be a gap between what the regulators understand and what the technology firms are capable of doing. And so that's really hard because it's kind of cloaked. Many would be surprised that it's not anonymized, like the fact that we can put enough of your data together to figure out actually who you are. So there's been some journalistic reporting based on figuring out your GPS locations based on aggregate data, your personal stuff. So I would say that is still going back to Lee's point, like how do we individualize the harms? that's a great question. I think quantifying it's going to be near impossible, but I think if people begin to care about it, because right now they don't. Like, you know, everybody clicks through the privacy policies. Everybody, you know, and then when GDPR came out, you know, you got all of those notifications, and I don't know, like whatever, give me the full screen. But if we see more public exposure, I think that might help in that regard, especially in terms of the manipulative behavior. And so like the gamification of Uber drivers now, where they can predict what will keep Uber drivers on the platform longer so that they provide a greater supply to match driver demand to make Uber more money. And so I'm not quite sure if I'm answering all your questions, but that gap between what we think they're capable of and what they actually are capable of is very different. Yeah.
Is it, you're saying that people don't care, young people don't care.
Yeah.
Is it that they don't actually care, or we just don't know how to recognize how they do care? Like, we're not looking, like us old people are used to looking over here for harms and, you know, righteousness. Mm-hmm. We don't even know to look over there where we would look.
Right. And that I would say they don't know they should care, perhaps. Like, one thing that inspired this paper was the scam I got, where they knew my password. They said, your passport is X. Well, my password was Barrett. I've changed all of it and gotten LastPass. But it freaked me out because they knew my password. They knew where I lived. And then they said, send a bunch of Bitcoin to this, you know, account. And then I was like, oh, I feel this because I had to go buy, what did I buy? The Norton, whatever, and I'm thinking about getting insurance, and a lot of companies are thinking about getting insurance now. And so when you have those actual experiences, you then become very aware about how easy it is for your data to hurt you. Does that make sense?
What did you think was harmful about what they told you?
Because I was almost ready to pay for it. I called like it's 15 because they had some information. I was like, don't. They claimed they had some information. I was like, I don't want that out. I didn't know if it was true, but you know, there were things they said I had on my computer or my webcam and stuff like that. I'm like, no. And so that was my real first experience with, oh, here's where I'm hurt. I also had my credit card stolen, my number, probably 4 times. I have to change all my, you know, numbers and that sort of thing. And so I'm also annoyed, and I had to spend, you know, time value of money to get that done. So we're beginning to recognize how it actually hurts us. We're not fully there yet. You look at the difference between what surveys say we care about and what we actually do, and very much so we're not caring, and we should. And that's why this paper probably has, you see a lot of holes, but it's beginning the conversation because it's the first one that says this should be looked at perhaps in this way. Lee?
Yeah, let me see if I can tie up some of these comments. So I think, Scott's point to some extent is privacy a continuous variable or is it 0-1? And for the Germans, it's 0-1. I mean, their privacy laws have always been, it's very difficult to get into a German's house. I mean, unless they're evading taxes, that's the only way you get into their house. But that's important. But that's a normative issue to some extent. How should we as a society view privacy? And if it's a continuous variable, then it can be priced. Mm-hmm. It sort of gets at Chuck's point, and a bit at Nick's point. And then it's a property right. Mm-hmm. And then you would think there'd be entrepreneurs who said, oh yeah, Abby, you're really keen on your privacy. You can pay for Facebook. $100 a month, pay for Facebook. We'll guarantee you, and we'll give you an insurance policy if you should ever be harmed. But you're paying $100 now a month to do whatever people do on Facebook. Mm-hmm. So you could have 2 different models. One is, we're going to lock all your privacy stuff over here, mm-hmm. but you get to use this platform and search and post your pictures and do all this stuff. So that would be something that clearly the FTC could do to give consumers more choices, but that would assume privacy's, in a sense, a continuous variable and can price it.
Right.
And I think it can be priced, because individuals
Go back to
will
the
differ in terms of how much they would, how fearful they are, how much they care,
Right.
what they have to hide, whatever.
Yeah, so, yes. So, because I only had 7 minutes, I wonder if you, and this is what I asked Scott, like, with this Solov taxonomy, there is a spectrum, right? So if we think about what's least harmful, it's the collection of our data. So buying the cheap webcam cover. And then we have analyzing, and this one I had a hard time. I was like, how many people go to their therapist because Uber can tell they're drunk? I'm not sure about that. But these, again, are real costs. And then with this dissemination one, this is where I think there is a cottage industry developing. And we keep going back to the insurance, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that, especially for companies when they have a phishing scandal and all of their data is collected. They are paying a lot, both in terms of fines and putting it back together and making sure they don't lose customers. And so those are real costs. And so in terms of what you're
They're very
saying,
enormous.
yeah.
I mean, I don't get too psychologically hung up about if you know I'm drunk or not. I mean,
I get it. That's why they can't see my webcam.
WhatsApp.
But so does this help in your concerns here? Because I think I
well,
don't.
but I think it goes back to this initial thing that Scott raised, is certain things are just things that are sacred. That this is just your right for people not to have this information.
Right.
Or another thing is, no, it's something that I can sell. Sort of Chuck's point.
Right.
And so it depends on, that's this normative issue of how we want to think about what privacy is. There's certain rights that people have that are not continuously negotiated over. And so I think that's kind of a good starting point, and we've been kind of led down this path where we didn't know we were giving away all this information. But then it's who should be the insurer, and why not have a different business model, as I said, where Facebook sells you, in a sense, insurance, guarantees that your stuff's not going to be used, but you're going to be paying to use the platform.
So can I respond to that real quick?
Yeah, sorry.
So the premise here is that we have as a given, right, or as, a constant, that we have dominant platforms.
Yeah.
And so if I can only deal with cottage industry firms like the insurance companies, yes, there is a market I'm willing to pay, or you're saying Facebook should pay me, or I should pay Facebook?
You pay Facebook
to
use their platform,
right.
But they're not using your data.
Right, so I'm still paying Facebook on, Facebook is still getting more dominant. And so, yes, that might protect my privacy anymore, but it creates more of a monopolist, right? So
they're not getting more data because they're not.
No, but they're getting more money. So they're becoming even more ingrained.
Yeah, that's
okay. In the aggregate, Facebook has 1 billion users. So I would say if we think about firms getting larger and larger, making that negotiation just makes them larger.
The bigness, as Chicago said, is not necessarily harmful to consumers.
Chicago.
But I think you're right.
Yeah.
What's it do to consumer, and what's the alternative?
Yeah, and so right now, with the bigness, right, the consumers don't have much competition to, vote with their feet. Like I said, DuckDuckGo is ran by Amazon, essentially. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So, I have 3 short comments. One is about this nature of the monopoly. I think it would be more interesting to see it as a monopolistic competition, because, for instance, Facebook might just, stop being trendy in 5 years because people start moving towards Snapchat or some other services that are closely related but unique and different, right? So there is still certain kind of competition. It's not going to be Facebook too, right? It's going to be something similar but slightly different in terms of preferences of how people want to communicate to each other. Now, the nature of each of these monopolies is the fact that on one side, people benefit from having a lot of other people in the same network. Otherwise, it doesn't work that well, right? So we are going to be facing these monopolies. I think that that's inevitable. And on the other side, of course, the other side of the business, how they make money, they also make money. I would assume, it would be an interesting empirical question, that the relationship is not linear, right? So the more data that you can get is definitely almost exponential, the things that you can do because machine learning improves way more, etc. So definitely that will be like a whole other discussion of why these monopolies exist and whether we can stop them or not.
Right.
And then I was actually thinking something similar to Lee in terms of, there might end up being an arrangement in which you as a consumer decide whether to share or not your data, and if you decide not to share it, that has a value that you pay, a price that you pay to the company in order to access the network, right? But I think what is also really interesting is that the 4 categories that you present also allow us to think in terms of what is exactly what we care about, right? So, me, Ricardo, I really don't care if they have my data, right? Okay. If they use it for analysis, that's fine. If they disseminate it, that's a problem for me. You know? And if they use it to manipulate democracy, of course, that's a problem to me as well, right?
Exactly.
So we might be thinking here in terms of 4 different components to privacy, let's say, right? And for some of them, I care, and for some others, I don't.
Yeah, and so it's like it's your scale, or your 0 to whatever.
Yes, but not necessarily. I mean, I also thinking about Scott's idea of, okay, this isn't a cost-benefit approach. I was like, well, maybe let's go even more old school and think about willingness to pay and willingness to accept in order to identify how much do I care in each of the 4 categories, right? Well, it's my willingness to pay for stopping them to get my data, 0, you know? To analyze it, probably 0. To disseminate it, yeah, that's different, right? And for each of the 4 categories, I might have a different value. So
They'd be willing to pay.
100% yes.
Or accept.
All.
Diane?
Yeah, I mean, this is just a two-finger on points that I think are surfacing throughout the room, and I think it actually matters whether or not individuals perceive these things as costs, right? And the fact that, I mean, you're saying people click through the privacy agreements and they don't really care. I think it's hard to make the argument of costs and harm if people don't perceive them as costs or harm, right? I mean, there's the great meme going around on Facebook right now, 1994, don't get into cars with strangers, 2004, don't connect with strangers on the internet, right? 2014 Uber, right?
Yeah.
Where you're using the internet to connect with strangers and get in their cars, right? But we're all okay with that, and even some of the things, right? I mean, I watch my Facebook profile change, and it's super creepy that they know all sorts of things about me. But all I think is, it's creepy, but damn, that actually is a really nice targeted ad, right? Like I do need those things, right? And so I think that's a really important piece here that goes beyond just coming up with a good typology of harm, is whether or not individuals actually care about these costs.
Yeah, and I feel that thread running throughout this as well. And so I would ask the group, is it okay to say, yeah, they don't care right now. They don't feel it right now. Because all the survey data says they don't. But I feel, again, that word, that as more exposure happens, and will, I truly believe it will, we get more congressional testimony, we get more reporting that says Uber can tell when we're drunk. And so this is ready. This is perhaps ready.
I mean, so from the political science data, we're not even seeing Cambridge Analytica and threats to democracy moving that scale, right? And so, like the drunk thing, like it's not working. It's not changing.
And I agree. Like Cambridge, Google's or Facebook's stock went right back up after it.
So I don't know what the precipitating event is that like actually is going to move
and
this.
I don't know what it will be either. And I totally agree. Yes.
Do you want to talk about the interest?
Where I said right down the line.
Do you want to talk about the interest issues at all?
I mean, you might have to educate me a little bit, but
it's no surprise that dominant companies can abuse their consumers, right? It's not no surprise. enterprise. They can charge them higher prices, they can give them crappy products, they can do all kinds of things. But we're at a point now in our antitrust regime that if they've gotten there legitimately, that size legitimately, we don't care that they charge higher prices. We know they're going to charge higher prices. We know they're going to have fewer quality constraints. So what would we do differently if we all of a sudden recognize privacy as something we care about if we know monopolies are going to exist and abuse customers to begin with?
Great point. That's kind of Lee's comment that the Chicago School says monopolies aren't inherently bad.
It may be inherently bad, but we don't care about that if they haven't gotten there in the illegitimate way.
Yeah, illegitimate ways. But I would suggest go back and again, you
want to rewrite the antitrust.
No, I want to go back to the legislative intent. The Chicago School was a move that's not necessarily grounded in what the statute, how it should have been interpreted. A set of statutes should have been interpreted. So, I mean, that's a loophole.
So to make this work, you'd have to rewrite the antitrust jurisprudence as well as recognize privacy.
Exactly, and Poster could do it. Why can't I?
Yeah. So, hi, I'm Shauna. I'm new to these. And
me too.
I actually was at the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division for 11 years and was the appellate staff person on Amex for a number of years. So I have thoughts about platforms.
Yeah.
But this may make us two ships passing in the night. And I think hearing all of this, one of the things, if you want it to resonate and have some reaction from practitioners or from an actual antitrust bar. I mean, Lena Khan's article, of course, I've never seen an article set off so many,
I know, a student note.
billion gallons of ink and popular press and receive such a general shrug from the thousands of antitrust practitioners because, what are you going to do with it, right? And I think part of it is that antitrust people think of themselves as enforcers. You're given a statute, you have to bring a case in front of a judge. It has to be a legal claim that is cognizable, and then you have to have done some discovery that you're going to bring, with Lena Khan's article, with political concerns, what are your CID specs? Like, what's your plans on threatening democracy? I don't know. And so then what does your case look like? And I think what that ultimately gets to is you're supposed to be thinking about remedies. So if antitrust enforcers don't do conduct remedies, if they're not looking to set themselves up for the next 40 years of monitoring all the privacy violations, who's in this position to do it? And I think that's why you keep getting pushed to some sort of other regulatory agency.
Yeah.
So is it you're going to have to answer the question. Europe right now has a much more, bonkers antitrust regime going on. They're fining Google billions. They did GDPR. It's culturally salient over there to have privacy concerns. Yeah. We care about guns. I don't know what we care about. You know what we care about, but it's not privacy. And so, so if it's a consumer protection thing, maybe the FTC's then someone on the consumer protection side can work on this. Is it transparency? Are we just not knowing enough? Should there be disclaimers that are in funny GIFs that we won't click through so that we understand how bad it is? And then maybe we make different choices, in which case maybe it's the FCC. That's a regulatory body. And then if you have a claim that someone, is violating your privacy, you file a regulatory claim and the regulators take care of it. Yeah. But you're just not going to get the FTC and the Antitrust Division to run privacy oversight regimes, that field. I mean, we have a citizen complaint center. And we sent out a form letter that's like, thanks for your interest in the antitrust laws, but that's about all you're set up to accommodate to do. Yeah. I'd also just say that in terms of this being kind of the first time that we see free or low-cost products, and, the data that they're collecting, they're not like eating it, they sell it to advertisers, and advertiser-supported business models have like a robust history. If you think back, network TV, newspaper circulars, phone books would be free, radio is free, and there is a robust history of antitrust enforcement in all those areas. No one's confused about free products. We understand that there's a market there, and if the market gets over-concentrated, you have the Rain Journal, you have all sorts of antitrust actions that have intervened in those areas where you have free products, but they understand it's an advertising market. And so market research has been around for a long time, and as far as I can tell, these kind of platforms are just the most efficient form of market research we've ever seen. People have, long been willing to put a Nielsen box on their TV and have everyone monitor their TV viewing habits. Now they can just do it on a much greater scale. But were there lessons that we learned in the market research area with advertiser markets that would make sense? This is just a bigger scale of that. And I can say from having reviewed mergers for a decade, we all talk about innovation harms. That's another thing that's like millions of gallons of ink. I don't know what to do. Again, what do we ask?
Yes.
You get a McKinsey white paper that's crap, and like you take a deposition, and you're like, probably some harm, an R&D budget. You know, I see privacy harm as being the same thing. What are you going to do with it?
Oh yeah.
So again, I think having, you know, thought pieces about how to like accommodate this as one of the harms is really interesting, and I think it would start a good conversation. But I just wanted to flag for you, you know, my brain's ossified. I'm old school. I even went to Chicago. It's so bad. I'm lost thoughts. But posters, my antitrust professor was all over. But I think it's, you know, real.
Yeah. Gosh, that's a really interesting perspective, and I want to go buy you a bourbon.
I always we'll register it on Instagram.
Because that's great, and you know, even if this is a thought piece that gets published, I'm not disappointed in that.
Yes.
Because
No, nor should you.
yeah, but I mean, those are great points. And darn it, I didn't think about the yellow pages. Yes. I'm so grateful I'm here, all of you. So fantastic, thank you.
I was gonna go over here. Yeah.
No, go ahead first.
So I keep thinking about banking regulation here, and I think, well, because or financial regulation. I'm a finance guy, because financial regulation. These data are only valuable when they're a large scale on the market research. They're not, and as for individuals participating, it's epsilon. I mean, we just, you know, the amount of harm it may hurt. So if you think about the value of the data, it's predictable. Okay, it's prediction. So in some sense, the prices people are willing to pay, that's the harm, right? That's their sort of one-to-one relationship. There has to be a one-to-one relationship. But you divide that harm by how many people you have, it's trivial. It's sort of like a banker who took a penny off of everybody's account once a year. But who would care? Right? Well, this is a violation of fiduciary duty under securities law and under banking law. In some sense, having access to the internet may be the regulatory, not antitrust, they are, you know, by having access to the internet, by having access to homes, maybe there's some fiduciary standard that they have that could be used instead of trying to sort of jury rig it, that's the wrong word, squirrel it into antitrust law.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you know, banks have the same problem. I mean, when you go into a bank, if somebody took a penny off your account, you wouldn't even know. Right? But that is a violation, and people will go to jail for doing that.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of thing I think that
Yeah.
I'd like to see in this regard.
Yes.
Well, I feel like the conversation kind of made a turn, but my comment was just going to be, because I feel like at one point it was mentioned, like, you know, if someone doesn't perceive a harm, can they be harmed? And so I'm in the school of public health, and I was thinking about, like, well, yeah, definitely, like, all the time we're exposed to different, like, environmental harms that we might not be aware of for several decades. Like, what I'm interested in for your class, Lee, Factory in Northwest Indiana has been putting lead out, and we think about lead in the water, but it's been building up in the soil for like 5 decades, and over time they've realized, like now in 2018, that like children in this community have like high levels of blood lead levels because of the soil, which is like harm that no one was aware of for several decades. So I'm curious about, because we talked about, like, there's this mention that like perhaps there'd be some catalytic event that we can't really think about what it will look like some period down the road, and maybe at some point, like, we can't conceptualize it now, but it'll happen, and so I'm curious what that could be. So that would be like a big scale across everyone, and maybe that would be like some sort of influence on election results or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's
But then I was also thinking, like, well, what if it was more like psychological, and like, so for instance, like I see people on Facebook like post really strange things, like, oh, if you copy paste this message into your status bar, Facebook won't be able to steal your data. I'm like, that's not how Facebook works. Like, that action does nothing. But I do think that it spurs some like distrust of institutions that might correlate with like distrust of like other institutions, like NOAA that gives us climate change data or something. So I'm curious what you could do with that too.
Yeah.
So just
Snowden, right. Like, we are very skeptical of government surveillance now, more so than we were in the past, perhaps.
I mean, just what about social good?
Yeah,
That's my problem.
Yeah.
And you know, the fact that Google can better predict influenza outbreaks than the Center for Disease Control, that's a good thing. I mean, presumably, that if it's a predictive device and we know that we should have more of this, you know, drug for people here than there, So there's social harm, and I'm not on Facebook and these things, so I don't know. They don't have me in there, which you also have biased data to begin with, I think. So who's being manipulated? But the flip of it is there's social good through some of these things that Google's doing, presumably.
Absolutely. But just because there's good doesn't mean there's only
Oh,
good.
oh,
Yeah.
I'm on the harm part, but I'm with Ricardo on those last two. Manipulating elections really bad, identity theft's really bad. Psychological costs, I don't know.
Right, me either.
But, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go.
So, I'm glad we're bringing it back to the notion of whether users are aware of user care or not. Because my operational theory about privacy as a researcher in the view is that the problem is not whether the user care or don't care. I think that's a wrong question, because you wouldn't ask that question. You wouldn't ask a person who's under influence of alcohol to care or something. And I use that metaphor because that's exactly how technology mediates with outstanding privacy. It used to be that, I understand privacy spatially because I know that the person across the room can hear me, not the person in the other room. But now, a person 1,000 miles away can hear me, presumably. And it just mind-bending for people. So I think instead of asking whether consumers understand or consumers care or not, we have to ask a different question, which is how this kind of technology mitigates outstanding and how it complex outstanding to the level that we cannot anymore comprehend what privacy is. And I think that's the difficult question, is how does it mitigate our understanding?
Yeah, and I would say that is why so many people push this towards consumer protection, because we don't know ourselves or how we're being manipulated. Like, subliminal message advertising was, the FCC was like, as soon as people thought that was happening, we had laws. But again, I think to start the conversation on how antitrust might play a role here, I agree that consumer protection laws are probably a way better way to protect us from ourselves, because we are in the dark about how unrestrained and unnoticed this is. So I would answer that. Like, all your ideas, I think, are incredibly valid, or incredibly good, but those might be better addressed by a different set of laws.
We are officially out of time, so let's thank Abby for her paper.
Thank you.